Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the spring semester here at CCA. Aren't you all happy about that? Closer to your end, as we will talk about in narrative class. I'm Cheryl Dunye, and I will be your leader in the narrative symposium, the class that will accompany our narrative grad lecture series. That class meets on Fridays from 12 to 3 in GC1, and it's called Narrative Interactions. And there's a little sign-in sheet if you already are signed up for that course. But this is the lecture series that does accompany the course, so that's something to note. At any rate, I'm here to tell you a little bit about this opening faculty roundtable that we're having here to sort of bust open a conversation and dialogue that I think is a wonderful thing to engage us all into deeper thought around our practice when it comes to narrativity, storytelling. The biggest question here that I've asked all my fellow colleagues here from a variety of programs in the campus is, how are narrative structures used to provoke, communicate, and engage audiences? And this roundtable is really going to have these practitioners and your esteemed professors talk about this in their own work and their practice and their programs. So this is just a kickoff, and again, this is going to be the subject of the Graduate Symposium that will be running throughout the semester. And I will tell you, I'll just get that over with right now about the events. I think tonight is the opening night where we're going to talk about this. On February 21st, and this is all online, I'm just repeating the line. We're going to have a lecture by Paul Miller, also known as DJ Spooky. He's going to present his work entitled The Book of Ice. Another visiting professor, faculty member here in the writing program, a member of our faculty in the MFA writing program, Juvenal Costa, will be doing a lecture on February 28th. All of these lectures are happening here at Timken, except for DJ Spooky, which will be happening in our Kansas Street space, which is our new space. Then on March 7th, we're going to have a performance lecture presentation by Sister Spit, the Bay Area wonderful, rowdy gang of performers, lesbian, feminists, etc., spoken word performers. And there'll be a reception around that. And then Scott Snibbe is coming, who's a wonderful media artist and entrepreneur, known for his work with Bjork and her Apt album. And then also, one of the wonderful things about this class is that you're going to make work collaboratively around narrative. And that show will be on March 18th through the 22nd over on the Oakland campus, and it's going to be called Linked Elegance. And you're going to the group will have made a renga, which is a Japanese word poem, and we'll make it collaboratively and visually, or whatever you want to add to the sauce in the mix. So members in the class will have a show with their work. I think the opening is the 20th. So no further ado, I'm going to just do some loose but well-rounded introductions of the esteemed panel and roundtable that I've gathered here. It's so interesting. I've been teaching narrative and making film in my own work, experimental, more straightforward narrative, did some stuff with Miramax craziness. I won't even talk about that. Well, I will, I have to. But, coming here to CCA and really sort of, practicing what I preach and teaching what I preach, it's very, I was very pleased to have been tapped by Andrew to teach his course and teach this version of this course. So I think Andrew Linden is our sort of innovator here in wanting to sort of organize the Graduate Symposium into a class or a series where it can have a better container so more things get discussed in and outside of this room. And Rachel, yes, Rachel Schreiber, who's not here actually. She also is one of the people on board who tapped me to, be, a collaborator with you, graduate students, in making this happen. But Andrew is a videographer, animator, and filmmaker who makes standalone video, freelance multimedia work, video theater sets, and narrative film. He is a digital imaging and video instructor at Pixar Animation Studios and was the editor for SIGGRAPH 2005 Computer Animation Festival, CAF, producing and editing the festival's trailers. He has a BFA from Bennington College, an MFA from Yale University, and that's it. He'll actually go into a little bit more. I have a lot more to do. So this is Andrew, right to my left here. Yeah, wow. Next to Andrew, we have Christian Simsarian, doctor. He's the chair of the Undergraduate Interaction Design program here at CCA. He believes in the power of design to simplify, enrich, and transform our lives and the world. All of us do, right? Yeah, thank you. His work focuses on bringing innovative human-centered design and strategy to meaningful fruitions in education and organizations, from pixels to processes. I'm not going to go deeper into that, but you can also, everybody's going to talk about their practice. Welcome, Christian. Next, we have, Christian, we have Kim Ano, a wonderful faculty member. She was born in Los Angeles and is a painter, photographer, and video artist whose work has been collected by museums nationally and shown internationally. She's been a professor at the college since 1996. She's shown work around the world, and she'll tell you more about where those shows are. She's been a recipient of a number of awards here, from the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art to the Open Circle Foundation's Fellowship, and she's working and collaborating with other artists within an ensemble of video artists and composers called Ice on the High, and a long-term video work, Men and Women in Water Cities. Welcome, Kim. Next, we have Brooke Hinton, excuse me. Brooke is the chair, as he says, of the film program and the chair of the MFA program in film that we are launching and will happen this fall. He is a San Francisco-based filmmaker and composer whose work ranges from narrative cinema to experimental multimedia performance. He has worked extensively as an editor, colorist, and sound designer, serving on Apple's editorial evaluation team during the development of Final Cut Pro, and designing courses and workshops in digital cinema, narrative, and experimental aesthetics, and post-production for BAVAC, Film Arts Foundation, eMotion Studio, Stanford University, and the San Francisco Art Institute, before coming to CCA in 2007. Welcome, Brooke. Just going through my list here. Sorry, everyone. Next to Brooke, we have Tanya Hamidity. And Tanya is a faculty member in the Diversity Studies program and teaches the interdisciplinary studio Alternative Bodies. Tanya is a freelance journalist, performer, and educator whose performance work and scholarship looks at the intersections of sexuality, gender, costume, and embodied knowledge. Recent performances include Beyond the Spectacle at the annual Desert Stories Symposium in Joshua Tree, California, and Tanya was voted one of the top 25 most significant queer women of 2011 by Velvet Park, Dyke Culture in the bloom. Welcome, Tanya. And last but not least, we have Matt Sility, who is a Chicagoland native. He is a professor in writing and literature, assistant professor in comics. You are the chair of the MFA comics program that's coming this summer. This summer, right? Assistant professor in the associate chair of the comics program already here. Chicagoland native, love Chicago. Taught 8th grade for 6 years in Champaign, Illinois. Woohoo! Before moving west to study creative writing at the University of California, Davis. It was there he discovered comics as a medium for fine art. Welcome, Matt. And I am Cheryl. I got through that wonderful introduction. I was born in Monrovia, Liberia. Oh, this is my narrative. Grew up in Philadelphia. Got my MFA at a graduate program at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, Mason Gross School of the Arts, where I studied. I think the person who touched me most there was Martha Rossler, who, when none of us were speaking in one of her lecture classes and engaging in conversation, and she had commuted from Brooklyn to New Brunswick to give this presentation, she said, "Okay, I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes to speak." She looked at her watch. Nobody said anything. "Okay, bye." She walked out. So I'm going to practice that in our classes, okay? I think maybe other people want to engage that. Martha really touched me in that time when I was there, and I met a wonderful bunch of people, moved on to making a film called The Watermelon Woman, and then moved west to make, not try to go in Hollywood, but end up doing a couple things with HBO and Miramax before I arrived in the Bay Area to teach here at CCA. So that's me. It's a linear narrative. These are some terms that we will talk about, but it's not over yet, so it's open-ended. So I'm just going to I guess I'll pass the mic to Andrew, who's going to do some more introductions and introduce you to one of the topics and themes, or I guess the main topic and theme that we're going to talk about tonight. Mic on.
Okay. Thanks, Cheryl.
You're welcome.
Usually when you come to one of these kind of events, somebody will say, Webster's Dictionary defines. No. But I did that for you, but I'm not going to tell you what I read because, is this working? Yeah. Because there are so many different definitions that you can see, and none of them seemed very satisfactory to me. Some of them said story, some of them said storytelling. Those are really different things. Some of them said narrative is narrative, which I thought was pretty cool. Some say it's a sequential, ordered group of information. So order being the main principle there. So there are a lot of different ways that you could talk about it, and it exists in many different forms. It can be something that you use as you're about to create something. It could be something which describes a group of people and how they behave or their beliefs. So I think we all kind of have in our toolbox an idea of what it means, and I would rather get us as confused as possible for the duration of tonight, and maybe we can. That's kind of the whole point, is to misapply ideas or notions about narrative across different forms. So first of all, before I ask the question of these guys, which they're already familiar with, I wanted to confuse you by quoting Wittgenstein. My work consists of two parts, one which is here, and everything which I have not written. And precisely the second part is the important one. And I like that because there are things that we do intentionally, and there are things that turn out to be the actual narrative, regardless of what we're trying to do. So with that in mind, I'm just going to repeat for you guys the sort of launch question that these folks have looked at already. And that is, how do traditional... Oh, I forgot to tell you one little story. The very first moment of wanting to do this happened in front of my house because there's a street in front of my house, which is the street I live on. And I know what that street is all about. It's the way that I get to my house. And that's what it is. That's what that street is. And I was out there one day, and there was a telephone and street repair person who was filling a hole with some asphalt. And I started talking to him, and I asked him how old the street was, and he said, well, that pothole is 12 years old, and that one is 30 years old. Those telephone poles are 60 years old, and he went back until he could tell me exactly the history of my street based on his practice. So his making was allowing him to create a narrative about the age of the street, and he went all the way back to 1917, just looking piece by piece. And so that was the first moment that I thought, he and I have two completely different stories. This means how I get to my house, and to him it means the history of his practice. So that's kind of the beginning of this, this event. So the question here is, how do traditional modes of narrative play a role in your practice? Which is to say, how do events or content or contents or behaviors appear in a structured way in time? Is there a critical activity which is distinctly the beginning, and is that always at the start in time followed by the middle? Conversely, has your practice or other contemporary practices altered the way we look back and think of traditional narrative? An example would be, I might ask Christian, how often are first, second, and third acts used in the way that you interact with a cell phone? Is it important to make sure that people do one thing before the other, then the other, and then the third in order to feel successful? Conversely, has the use of the iPhone or gaming or painting changed the way we think of first, second, and third act? And that might be, for example, that in a gaming environment or in the computer or navigating the web, which uses a lot of narrative nomenclature, you can go backwards and redo the first act, which would change the second act, etc. So it's not just sequential in time. So that's the question that I wanted to ask. And I guess just because I'm a linear person, I'll offer it to you to start off.
Was this the 10 minutes part, or do you want us to go briefer?
10 minutes.
10 minutes sounds great.
Right. Okay. Let's try and go briefer. The answer is no. So I wanted to start with a little story. The parents are filing into the room. This is a classroom for 5- and 6-year-olds. The teachers are standing by, quite proud. The children have been working for the last couple of hours setting things up, and the parents are taking a seat for what would be, to the observer, a performance. Except, and there's hand-drawn art that's covering the walls, and the floors are covered with crayoned drawings, and there's some 3D sculpture and other sorts of things that you'd expect to see in a 5- or 6-year-old classroom, 5 or 6-year-old's classroom. And the only thing that's different is is that all these things have been wired together. And there's projectors, and there's a sound system, and what's going to happen is telling of Red Riding Hood. And in fact, it's not a telling of Red Riding Hood, it's going to be 10 different tellings of Red Riding Hood with different sequences, different characters coming first or second, and as it happens in the moment, improvised. So the students, the pupils, the 5- and 6-year-olds have co-created with a box of technology, things that have RFID tags, buttons, switches, in order to project on walls scenes, plots, characters, make sounds that conjure up the Little Red Riding Hood, as well as their own acting. And they can go about this however they please. So in one moment, the button on the wall is the entering the forest, and the projection of the forest comes on. The next moment, it can be the doorbell for Grandma's house, and that depends on how the children have stepped on the stepping stones. And this was just fantastic. To watch this was wonderful. Everybody was having a blast, and it didn't come out at all like anyone thought it would. What I was describing is something that I'd done in a previous career in a school in southern Stockholm in Sweden. with the goal of introducing storytelling tools into a classroom with no evidence of what we call, using technology, but with no evidence of what we call WIMP, which is what we were calling WIMP, which up until about the introduction of the iPhone was the dominant mode people interact with computers. WIMP is windows, icons, mice, and pointers. So we wanted no evidence of that. We wanted the computer to come into the space, but not in this kind of traditional office sort of setting. So the challenge of that is, can you provide the Legos of narrative? Can you sort of find some elements there that can be constructed and put together however you please? So I use Legos or building blocks, and the goal of that work was, can we make collaborative new media, as we were calling it at the time, new storytelling tools that are as collaborative and creative as a box of crayons or a pile of building blocks. And what's interesting is, like, many years on, most of you in your pockets are carrying something that can do just that. One of my favorite breakdowns of narrative is the Seymour Chatwin's, and probably it's my favorite because it lends itself to this, which is the story and discourse. And the thing that's nice about that is time is not a fundamental part of that. There's a bag of stuff that's story, that's character and plot and props and settings and scenes and conflicts, which is probably part of plot. And then there's discourse, which is separated. So we can have Little Red Riding Hood happen in a classroom in a kind of non-linear, non-predictive way. We could have it happen as a ballet, as ice skating, as a movie, as a book, as a pop-up book, as a CD-ROM, and that it's still, in many ways, the same story. It has the same, there's a kind of consistency and coherence about that story that we would infer almost immediately that it's the same story. Oh, Little Red Riding Hood. Oh, great. Oh, but it's in a Tarantino sort of way. Now the grandma gets eaten first, and then we figure it out. I love this. It changes participation and puts it changes final cut, right? The story maker no longer has the final cut. It actually puts it out for all of us, and maybe there is no final cut. So changing control, and then possibly the end of that kind of control. At the time, I was really excited by things like Augusta Boal's Theater of the Absurd, where we're talking about mass participation. And I think we're in that moment. Like we've always lived a shared story, but now we have a kind of connected magic that's bringing that together. And technology brings us things like memory, it remembers very well. Interactivity, that if we do something, there's an invitation, we do something, it does something back, things can transform, and they can be completely different than they were before. The product can actually transform, its value and what it delivers and features and all sorts of things can actually transform based on what you did. The sort of interactivity that time t+1 is completely different than time 0. You can shift place. You actually can take something that would have happened here and it can happen there. I think we're all experiencing that with portability. A simple thing of today is you take a movie with you somewhere, which used to have to be in a certain place. You can shift time. On that same example, you can now watch something that would have been broadcast, you can watch it later. And we're seeing that in all sorts of ways. And there's sort of an expectation now that you can shift place and you can shift time with almost anything. I was curious, for example, if I could find out what my commute time would be at Oakland at a time, tomorrow morning at a time that I've never done it. I'm like, surely there must be some way for Google for me to say at 8:30 tomorrow, what's this again? Apparently there isn't, but I had this expectation that would be really easy to find, that I could shift that time and just see the traffic patterns. And I'm sure it's not that far off. There's just two more things. When Tanya was talking, it reminded me of, or when I guess somebody was talking about Tanya, I was reminded of a piece that that I have forgotten, but I love so much. I was fortunate enough to be part of the world's first multimedia opera, and this was in 1993 in Stockholm at the Dansens Hus. That was quite a big thing, and I was implementing directing the technology. And our goal was, we had concrete poetry, we had dance. Our goal was for the dancer to control what was happening. So it actually changed control. The movements and gestures of the dancer, there were all sorts of sensors that we had built to sense her position and what she was doing. She was triggering the events, the choreography. And that was really kind of fascinating. So the music and the visuals, and actually there was a chorus, were responding to her cues and the events that were happening. And then we also had, the membrane was a virtual world where she would disappear into this virtual world and come back, and there were robots that would disappear and come back. And in many ways, that idea of control is central, if you will, to this, where I think this narrative is going. And if you look at, so one of the speakers in this series is Scott Snibbe, and he has really tried to take these filmic experiences and make them live, make them participatory, create spaces that are interactive, where actors can come in and create a new sort of subjectivity. Andrew was quoting Wittgenstein, and almost everything that Scott is doing is in that Wittgensteinian or Stonian way, Steinian way, beyond language. Like, what are those things that are beyond language? Those things that we understand, those parts of narrative that we can get into and share that really can't be described. That we're participating in a game, we're participating in a story that is not describable. And that's the element that he loves to play with, is like, how do I get two strangers to interact and share something that they could never really describe, and they don't need to describe. They can just be watching and being with each other. So as soon as they get out of their civilized heads and into the sort of primal moment of in a space and aided by technology, it really becomes fantastic. So I think somehow I've been extremely fortunate. I was always an improv fan. I was always doing that on the side, and that became my avocation. I had an improv troupe that I was really passionate about for a while. And then I started to bring that more into my work. And that actually started to set a course off, because I got more interested in narrative and new media narrative, and then process. So Cheryl said this pixels to processes. Actually, in the moment, the brainstorming, the creative processes are also narrative. And in many ways, that still guides what I do. And the way we've created the interaction program here, because technology is changing so fast and tools are changing so fast, is we've built it around the things that don't change. So fundamentally, these are things like time, storytelling, narrative, people, and learning to learn. So collaboration and learning to learn. So there's like these fundamental things that don't change, that we're really the core of the program. And then the technology and tools kind of sit on top of all those. Like if you can get those fundamental things down, then you can easily tackle everything else that comes along. And you're building stories, and interaction designers are creating new ways right now, as we speak, for you to go out and find conflict, find new plot, find new characters, make anecdotes, extend your life in some new way that would be different if you didn't have like that thing in your pocket or whatever technology you're using. So that's my answer.
Groovy.
Hey, I'm going to talk about my work. For 22 years, I was a narrative resistor, and my work was really abstract and more conceptual and empty, and I thought that was good for me. And then 4 years ago, I had a big change. You know, the midlife thing. I had a midlife thing, and it totally changed everything about me, and one of them is changing my work. So I decided to become much more of an interdisciplinary artist, and I hosted a festival at my studio building, and I invited these composers from CINMAT, the Center for New Music and Technology at Cal, and we occupied my building and made all these projects, and that was so enlivening that I decided I really should think more deeply about what I want to do. And so I started to make films and movies and work with composers and eventually work with actors. It was kind of a process. I was working with puppet shows first. I was making little puppet shows. And I made water puppet shows. In Vietnam, there's elaborate water puppet shows, and I was very excited about how those were made, and I decided to make my own. So I made my own for a while, and I put books and things in tanks and made those books like little puppets and moving around in the tanks. And at the same time, at school, we had students that were starting to organize themselves around issues of the environment, and I remember going shopping and seeing all these green magazines, and it seemed like the environmental movement was starting to really have some sort of a apex of some kind of energy. And I was wondering, about that. I mean, I was always an environmentalist, who isn't? But then suddenly there was so much going on, and so I started to get more involved in it. And now the center of my work really is looking at issues of the environment, and I'm making work in the area that is defined since the 1960s, 70s, some people say 20s, as the area of expanded cinema. And in this area, I'm working with ideas of narrative structures, but not in the overall formal putting together of the whole film. So it's kind of an idea of flexible narrative structures, and really how the stories develop is in the interaction with the actors. And so what I'm trying to do, and so that's another kind of really a little bit irrational thing, is that I'm really thinking about the end of the world in a kind of way, like I'm sure lots of people are. So my project that I'm making is about post-sea level rise society and trying to adapt to a watery world for those in port cities and coastal areas, and trying to maintain an aesthetic and an intellectual life in a watery world environment, and which is very irrational and kind of crazy in a certain way. So that means I got underwater equipment, and I started to learn how to film underwater and in water and in rivers and pools and tanks and oceans. And I also went, and I realized that this problem of sea level rise is really a global problem. And so there is no end to the sites that you could go around and film in. And so I just started to go where I had contacts or places where I could engage with people. And I realized working with people in these areas that I'm filming in is very instructive and interesting. They too have their stories and their narratives and their challenges. And at first I started to make out something kind of dark, like, wow, it's really gonna be weird, like hard and difficult. But the people that I work with are always bringing up very positive things, very lighthearted things, games and affection and sensuality and fun. And so as my actors started to do their work, and much, I guess in an improvisational way that you're sort of talking about, I too began to change what I was doing and shaping. So I'm really learning from the actors what I'm making. And one that was very dramatic and interesting and such an incredible experience was going to South Africa, and in which I was working with some young people from KwaZulu-Natal province who were all from different townships, and they all came into this one area of Durban on the beach, this art center. And I taught them some basic skills in video and sound editing, etc. And then in turn they were my actors, and we made a sequence there, and I was very excited about it. And they too, I mean, we were keeping up contact, and we were discussing too about the environment and all the issues. Although when you're in South Africa, you're not necessarily thinking about issues of water and water distribution, for instance, which is a big issue for me. They were thinking a lot about AIDS and the 40% of the adult population that's HIV positive, and how there is so little access to higher education. In fact, right when I came back, there was like a stampede to register for university education, and a couple people were killed in the stampede. There was so much urgent matter to get registered to go to college. So they taught me a lot of things about their lives and their stories, and that was very rewarding, and it made me realize as I'm going around making these films in this expanded way, and the films are meant to be both on the internet and public artworks and multiple screen channel works in museums and galleries. The final form isn't quite yet determined by me. I just know that I have to do it, and I'm working on it now. And there's a new project that is called Water City Berkeley, which is working with some Berkeley high school students, quite a few, maybe 50 to 60 or 70 Berkeley high school students are going to be actors in my film, and we're working together this semester, actually, and as I go, I'm picking up other kinds of people and their issues and what they bring to it, and one of them is this idea of the nation state not serving the population, as we really saw in Hurricane Katrina, for instance. And so this idea of post-nation states, like associating with ourselves outside of the nation state in new kinds of ways or other kinds of ways, I'm interested in that as well. And then the third thing I just want to say about it is that it's also intersecting art and science, which is an area that I'm really interested in developing here at the college, and I'm starting an online journal called The Artist and the Scientist with another scientist, and we're making this project a kind of global project that will be organically fed by editors on all of the continents of the globe, so that we can have these global kind of dialogues that we should be having in the face of such enormous disaster. Thank you.
I just go, okay. Hi, I feel naked. I don't have a piece of paper to refer to or anything. Thank you. This is great. I just wanted to mention something somebody else long ago said first. Laurie Anderson, who some of you are probably familiar with. I always, actually, I'm getting so old now, I realize these references sometimes don't register. Does everyone know who Laurie Anderson is? Okay, good. A lot of people thought that as this person who's basically a storyteller, all of her work is about telling stories, and because she was so technologically savvy and so her work is so based in technology, that she would be a pioneer in interactive narrative. And I remember this interview with her, and I wish I could quote it exactly. It was a video interview, and I don't have the exact quote, but I remember the first words perfectly were, "You have to be careful with stories." And she went on to talk about how stories are very powerful and they can kill people. And she used the examples of the national narratives that various nations have used to commit horrible atrocities, etc. I want to hopefully circle back to that. And by the way, since I don't have prepared anything, if I start to ramble, somebody go stop or something, please. So I started out in theater and music and thought, like Kim, that I was all about the abstract. I now realize I was not even then. I was studying theater and staging, Beckett plays and old Sam Shepard plays that seemed to be very anti-narrative. And musically, I was classically trained, but I was drawn to noise music, avant-garde composition, and going against all these traditional forms, trying to thwart the narrative experience, basically. All of which was basically a narrative that was being created. These all had a latent narrative in them. And I had this amazing realization at one point when I started making films, and I was making what I thought were very abstract films, and I was and continue to be inspired primarily by experimental filmmakers, by Stan Brakhage, Ernie Gehr, Michael Snow, a lot of these people. And I was looking at their work and my own work, and my approach to making films, to making music, to telling stories, to performing, and I suddenly realized, oh my God, it's all been narrative the whole time. the whole time I've been doing this, in fact, a huge percentage of these supposedly structural anti-narrative films I've made all had the same story. They were basically about people or various things in nature attempting to do something and failing, and the things that kept them from achieving these things. So around this time, I was also teaching at the San Francisco Art Institute at a time when they were trying to integrate narrative into what had been traditionally a completely non-narrative film program that held that almost as this holy thing. Narrative, that's, much as I thought when I was younger, that's the evil, horrible, fascist thing coming down to try to make us put a structure on everything. It's awful. And so I became basically, as a result of trying to reconcile this realization about narrative with my feelings about narrative that were very deep, that I had this kind of intuitive sense, but there is something dangerous here. I became kind of a narrative nerd. I got really into narratology, and trying to talk about narratology to freshmen is a really interesting experience. But I have ended up approaching narrative, I think, in a very different way than other people here are talking about. I think of narrative as a force of nature, as something that is out there, and in that way, really, there's no such thing as a non-narrative work of art, because we're hardwired to seek narratives, to find stories. We can look at the most abstract piece, and we have to at least create a story ourselves that's about our own response to it. The first time I saw Mothlight by Stan Brakhage, which is a film, if you're not familiar with it, where he taped pieces of dead moths that had flown into the light in his cabin onto translucent film and made a film out of that, I thought that was an abstract film, and I later realized, no, that's actually a narrative film. It's about Stan Brakhage realizing that these moths would create these amazing patterns on a piece of film, and I had all these years in my head this image of him laboring over this film. It was a story. It was a myth. But I approach narrative, like I said, as a force of nature, as something that's potentially both very powerful and very dangerous, and that at its heart is always a lie. It can be, as they say, the cliche, the lie that tells the truth, but it's a filter on reality. Instead of, and I want to respond directly to Andrew's question about, does Act 1 now happen first? This whole thing about structure. I think of 3-act structure, 5-act structure, Freytag's pyramid, all of that stuff, as not so much what narrative is, but as models that we've created to look at narrative. But that narrative is basically out there. It's a psychological phenomenon and it's a natural phenomenon. And that when we put these structures on it, what we're doing is basically filtering reality. It's our psychological need to make sense of what's basically chaos. So it's a reductive process for me rather than a building process. Rather than taking the tools of building stories, I look at reality, my experiences, other people's experiences, and I feel like I'm filtering out as ethically as I can, and hopefully as powerfully as I can aesthetically, and to whatever end I'm trying to reach, filtering out what is unnecessary to create a specific experience, and then putting that into the best possible form. All the time trying to keep in mind that what I'm doing is on a certain level not an honest process, but that it is a process that can help me reach perhaps a deeper truth and communicate that truth, to understand something about the world more clearly. So it's just a very different way of looking at it, and I've been struck listening to everybody. I didn't really realize it until that it was that different until I was listening to all of you talk, that I start from out here rather than from what's 3-act structure, how do you build characters. I do all of those things, but that's more of like the detail work much later. That's not really the basis of it. And I want to talk a little bit about interactivity. And Christian and I have talked about this quite a bit in discussions about why I think it's a problem for somebody like Laurie Anderson, and particularly for filmmakers, to try to adjust to this. We're used to this very fixed, ritualistic structure in which films and time-based media are exhibited, and it's based on time. And it's always, we're deciding when Act 1 starts. What defines what Act 1 even is? We have total control over this. And there's something very powerful about that, of course, from the maker's perspective, because we can then deal with narrative as a psychological force. We can leave things out in time by leaving these gaps that you have to fill in, information that's not there that you have to bring in to create an experience that is on this very fundamental level interactive, but at the same time is dependent on this fixed time structure where, in a very politically incorrect way, you're all captive. You're stuck in the time frame that we've created for you. Now with interactivity, that's all out the window. So the interesting challenge to me, and it's something I'm really thinking about right now in my own work, is how do you create, in this age when we all expect to push the button and have something happen, where if we're bored, we don't have to sit and wait for the image to transform into something where we say, oh, aha, that's what they were getting at. That instead, it's like, I want this to change. I'm used to that happening. How do we create that kind of powerful experience that empowers both the creator and empowers the participant? And I think a lot of the things Christian was talking about, where we're creating, rather than thinking of it as these singular works of art, we're creating environments where people can have experiences that become almost the subject of narratives, more than they are narratives themselves. I think that's one very powerful way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like it's a very young form right now, and that we've barely started to really consider how interactivity impacts the psychological aspect of experiencing a narrative and creating, as a viewer, what the narrative is that we're watching. So that's kind of where I am. As far as my own work, really briefly, I still make experimental films, as well as I have made a narrative feature, which was another thing that made me come to terms with a lot of this. But I approach them all now as narratives, even if they don't have people in them. I'm dealing with the modulation of tension and events in time. Even if those events are as simple as the way wind is blowing through trees here, related to something that's static in another part of the frame. Those are still fundamental narrative things, because the viewer is creating an experience that is about tension, that's about movement, that's about things changing in time. And that's something I try to emphasize to my students. You can't just abandon narrative and say, no, I don't work with narrative. I'm a structural filmmaker, I'm an abstract filmmaker. It's there whether you want it to be or not. It's our human nature to try to plug some structure into something because we can't understand chaos just as it is. So no matter how abstract you want to go, you have to be responsible and deal with the fact that at some fundamental level you are making narrative work. And that carries with it a huge ethical responsibility because, again, stories can be dangerous, and at heart, stories are not true. Something's left out. Otherwise, all of our countries would get along, there'd be no wars, it would all be very simple. So I'll leave you with that.
Cool. Hi, everybody. Okay. Well, I'm going to just share a little bit about my work and a little bit about my process as it relates to time and what I've discovered about time, and a couple of theories that have consistently guided me over all the different kind of mediums that I've worked through. So I'm a performer. I've been a drag king. I was a drag king in the 90s for a little over a decade, and when it was not really new, well, it was newer than it is today, but kind of linked up with identity politics and reclaiming the streets or reclaiming public space. And so intervening with like all of the normative constrictions or scripts of public space, and including kind of business as usual and time as usual and corporate practice as usual and everything that is at that time for a million reasons, constricting the expression of queer desire and queer visibility and queer identity. And that practice, as you know, drag kinging, drag queening, is about stepping inside a genre, pop songs, jazz, stepping inside of music, and then performing a story within those stories. So pushing back against kind of normative or hegemonic meanings and codes and discrimination, and speaking back to them through a new story, which is the story that you tell by actually lip syncing. So it's I still find it a fascinating medium. I don't find it voiceless, but something about being able to tell a story through this interesting technology of synchronicity, lip synchronicity or lack of synchronicity, and creating for your audience both an exchange of energy, because performance is about storytelling through engagement with your audience, no matter the size, through all these woo-woo things like energy, hypnotism, cues, legible cues, using images or referencing certain parts of culture so you can tap into kind of collective knowledges, right? Or a pop song, to engage your audience. If you're a performer and it's not going well, you can tell, right? So it's really about interaction, even though it seems to be about the spectacle, about just being watched. It's very much a skill building set that's about making space for your audience by feeling your audience. And I think in terms of, and it's about the body, right? Certainly, and it's all about communicating through the body. So in terms of time, for me, storytelling is going to unfold in a performance, and your job is merely to figure out your story as quickly as possible while you're performing, because it's about intuition, and it's about making good choices that are about being quiet and all these things that you learn as an artist at all, right? About getting in your groove so that you make decisions and the story is told, and both you don't know what it is and your audience takes away their own stories. And then the dance is over, right? The performance is over, and in fact, even if it's on a digital archive, if somebody's taking pictures, those are different stories than what actually happened in the live space. So I really like live performance because it opens up the possibilities for so many stories, and in that way has like a democratic possibilities. But drag kinging and kind of working within pop culture or whatever, music culture, really excites me because it deals with visual spectacle, visuality, the language of the visual, and sound. And I think that sound has its own tools, vibrations, tones, just everything that is sound, that when you interact, you put it on a body, or you separate yourself from the song. You're doing something within the song that Whitney wasn't doing when she sang Greatest Love of All. You are, you're using those two tools, and I forgot, I lost my train of thought. But for me, really, it's about visuality and sound, and that those two kind of mediums are ones that I love to work with, and costume. Just a couple of other pieces that I think, I've been greatly influenced by Trin Min Ha, the filmmaker, experimental documentary filmmaker, not just documentary. And their early work was reassemblage from firelight to screen, and she says she's trying to tell, she's a visual anthropologist. So I think a lot of the similar politics around the power of narrative have influenced me, meaning, the stories that are told and reproduced in the thing that we call history are the stories of the dominant class, right? Dominant power, structures of power. So story is politically loaded, and as coming from my own identity, but also being a social justice activist, I want to make space to tell the stories that are not necessarily being valued within mainstream culture. So her film is about, I'm going to tell a story about Senegal, but she says, but what about Senegal? And her whole, she comes up with this idea of standing nearby. And it's a challenge for her with the camera to figure out how you can tell a story and have the camera on, but have it nearby. And I like that concept of nearby, and also of standing, because that's an embodied practice. And so the idea of knowing the effect that story has on you at an embodied level, whether it's Diamanda Gallis screaming really loud, and you're like cringing, and if you don't know, if you're cringing, and all of a sudden that affects your story because you can't stand this screaming music, or you feel some beat and you're like, yeah, and so all of that is part of your own, of an audience's storytelling or story interpretation. So I'm interested kind of theoretically in the role of the body in story. Just a couple of ideas. The rhizome, Deleuze and Guattari talk about this idea of a rhizome. A rhizome is a subterranean root system that follows desire. And so the desire leads us through a story. And that there are many entrances and exits to an image, a story. So if I were to, so in summary, like the idea is, a rhizome, that idea is powerful to me because performance is about making images and then telling it through keeping that image sustained and using your body to tell the story. And someone can read you here, or they can read what they see here. It's about many entrances and exits. So for me, I think time is important as a structure. It's something for me to enter. I work through genres, and the last piece that just to mention is I'm working on this thing called Getting Beyond the Spectacle, which is it came out of I live in the desert, the Mojave Desert, part-time, especially in the summers when it's 110, and what I found is this nostalgia, like some painters that I know, oil painters, have this nostalgia for these like abandoned, shacks, and we all sort of love ruins because it's this feeling of sort of hope at the same time as remorse and longing. And I love ruins as well, but I felt very defensive when I found out that a lot of these painters could take pictures of these shacks and make $5,000 to $10,000 selling a painting if they're lucky. But they could, right? And then it turns up in Abercrombie and Finch in a lithograph, right? And then all of a sudden, corporate America is, right, creating these myths. But living in the desert at a physical level and working on houses, which is something I do because I like to build, is grueling. And the America's past and our rural cooking over with a pot and over the fire with one spoon, it's nostalgia. And so I started to think as we move forward to try and figure out what we're going to do, right, is a sustainably oriented new economy, right? What this new economy that we're all creating, it's about creating an identity. I thought, well, how can I get into the spectacle, push back on those images, push back on icons, iconographic meanings, to find something else in them. So for me, living in the desert, it's really hot. You suddenly realize a lot more about that story of America's past. So as a process, for me, as a process, the body, again, is very important for me, and I tend to put myself in situations to learn, put myself in those situations to learn about it in ways that aren't just having someone tell me about, underwater basket weaving, and then it comes in here, and then I write it. So, and I wanted to just say one other thing because
One other thing, because we're going to move on.
Okay.
and kinda have-
Yeah, just queering. So just that queering is breaking apart binaries, and so any binary, male, female, black, white, able-bodied, disabled, those are all that queering practice is again about making space, and when you break apart time, it's about I'm trying to create space. Thank you.